911, what's your emergency?
It's my neighbor. He's been shot in the heart. He's bleeding badly. Please send an ambulance.
Ronald Louis Ruse Jr., known as Ron, was born on 20th of November 1959 and grew up in San Diego, California. He had 4 sisters and enjoyed an active and happy childhood, spending most of his time surfing at the beach or playing softball with his friends. He grew into an easygoing and sociable young man who became a car mechanic after graduating high school. His life was off to a promising start and he had a long and exciting future ahead of him, until he met Linda Ricchio. There are some who believe we never meet anyone by accident. They say that people are meant to cross our paths for a reason, and those who believe in love at first sight would agree. When Linda joined Ron's mechanic firm as an office assistant, it might have felt like the hand of fate had brought the pair together. What they didn't know was that this would be one story that didn't have a happy ending. Linda was attractive and outgoing, with a positive mindset and a strong will. She wanted to go to college and was carefully saving the wages from her new job to pay for it. The pair noticed there was chemistry between them straight away, and after meeting for drinks after work a few times, they started spending more time together. Ron really liked Linda, but as he had a wide circle of friends and an active social life, he was happy to keep things casual. Their relationship quickly became more serious through an unexpected turn of events. One night in September 1980, Linda knocked on Ron's door in the middle of the night. In floods of tears, she explained that her mother had kicked her out of the house and she had nowhere to go. The kind-natured Ron, who was always happy to help people, invited her to stay with him in his apartment until she could get back on her feet. But Linda never left. Their close proximity to each other meant that things escalated at breakneck speed, and it wasn't long before they were spending almost all their time together. Despite Linda's neediness and her habit of inviting herself along to all his sports games and parties with his friends, he was happy, and even introduced his girlfriend to his parents and sisters. The family welcomed Linda and found that she was a good conversationalist who took the time to ask questions and get to know them. After a couple of months, however, the sweetness was rapidly turning sour. Ron started to notice more and more that Linda wasn't giving him the space to do anything without her, and if he wanted to go out alone or see his friends, she sulked or shouted until he capitulated and let her join him. She frequently called his family to find out where he was, if he was even a few minutes late home, and it was obvious to everyone around the couple that Ron was being manipulated and the relationship was far from healthy. But Ron wasn't a confrontational person and preferred to keep the peace, so he put up with things for a couple of years before he finally decided it was time to break things off. When he told Linda that it wasn't working between them anymore, her reaction was explosive and she threatened to commit suicide if he left her. Concerned that she might follow through with it, Ron agreed to stay with her for a little while longer. There followed a toxic cycle where Linda would be on her best behaviour for a while, then she would resume her old ways again, monitoring everything Ron did and trying to control his life. When it looked like Ron might try to break things off again, she would remind him of her suicide threat. It was another 3 whole years full of stress and control before Ron realised that enough was enough. He broke up with Linda for the final time in April 1986, moving out of his own apartment to escape the poisonous relationship. Although he had been clear with her that things were over, Linda didn't believe it was final, and at first Ron maintained a friendship with his ex and saw her from time to time. But he knew that for them to both move on, They needed to stop seeing each other, so he told her they would have to cut off contact. This time, Linda didn't threaten to kill herself. Instead, she said she would harm Ron and his family. But Ron was used to Linda's moods and ignored her, never really believing she had meant every single word. Linda started studying photojournalism at San Diego State University, and Ron met new partner Vicky Woodruff in September of 1987. Things went well in the new relationship, which was as different as it was possible to be from the way that life had been with Linda. When Linda heard about Ron's new girlfriend, she was furious, even though a year and a half had passed since she'd been part of his life. She demanded that he take her back, and when he refused, she embarked on a terrifying stalking campaign that put them on a collision course with tragedy. Ron received phone call after phone call from Linda at all hours of the day and night, and politely asking her to stop had no effect. He stopped answering the phone, but the calm of his evenings was repeatedly punctured by a shrill, insistent ringing that felt like it would never end. As a result, Ron's family found it hard to get in touch with him, as the landline was his only number, and he had no choice but to stop answering it, in case Linda was on the other end of the line. Ignoring his ex's calls wasn't enough to deter her. On the nights when Ron didn't pick up the phone, Linda would march over to his apartment and bang on the windows, screaming at him and begging for a reconciliation. Ron was so disturbed by her mental state that he kept his doors locked and his windows shut, even changing his locks to be on the safe side. He started looking over his shoulder everywhere he went, the overbearing shadow of Linda Ricchio casting an unsettling cloud over every aspect of his life. Unable to get through to Ron on the phone or at his apartment, Linda began tracking him around town, turning up at his softball games and his workplace. Each time he firmly asked her to leave, she shouted and cried, creating an embarrassing scene for Ron in front of his friends and colleagues. She even managed to get hold of copies of his phone and electricity bills. After all, she knew enough about him to get past any basic security questions the company asked, and privacy laws were much less strict at the time than they are today. Next, Ron's new girlfriend Vicky fell prey to Linda's stalking. Linda was watching Ron's apartment one night when she saw Vicky arrive, so she took the opportunity to note down her license plate number. The next day she called the Department of Motor Vehicles and told them a story she had cooked up overnight about hitting a parked car and needing the owner's details so she could contact them and make amends. It was really that easy. She now had Vicky Woodruff's address and phone number. She started following her around too and writing rambling letters saying that she had no right to date Ron. But Ron and Vicky were happy together, and they decided to stick it out but relocated 10 miles away to Carlsbad in the hope of evading Linda. Linda was furious about the move and was determined they wouldn't escape her. On one notable occasion, she followed one of Ron's friends, also called Vicky, to her workplace and confronted her. The surprised woman told Linda that she wasn't the right Vicky, but that Ron was free to be with anyone he wanted. Linda claimed to be pregnant with Ron's child, which was untrue, and issued a chilling warning that she would kill Vicky and any of Ron's friends who got in her way. Linda Ricchio's mental health was becoming increasingly unstable, and she was so fixated with following Ron around that she abandoned her job and her college studies so she could spend every minute of her day stalking him. She seemed to have lost all grip on reality and forgot that she even had pet cats to look after, and they were neglected and left to starve in her apartment while she was out tracking Ron and Vicky. In 1987, 7 long years after their paths had first crossed, Linda went to the home of Ron's sister Susan and said,
"I'm going to do something to your brother I'm going to regret."
Susan could see that Linda had lost any semblance of control, but she tried to reason with her, suggesting that the best thing to do would be to move on and live happily, realising that Ron would never come back to her. On the surface, Susan thought that Linda had heeded her advice and was a little calmer when she left, but this couldn't have been further from the truth. Maybe Linda's intentions had formed and crystallised while she stood on Susan's doorstep, ruminating on the situation. Maybe up until now, her threats had been empty ones. But any rational thoughts preventing her from delivering on them were now gone, and she was in an unstoppable downward spiral. By now, the previously relaxed and happy Ron had become uncharacteristically depressed by the constant strain of being followed everywhere by his angry ex, and he felt guilty that Vicky was now at risk too. He was reluctant to report Linda to the police because he feared they wouldn't take him seriously. The word stalking wasn't really used at the time, and there were few legal protections for victims of behaviour like Linda's. Even now, there's still a lingering perception that only women are subjected to stalking and domestic violence or harassment by partners, and it's not often talked about that men can be victims too, although thankfully times are changing, and with it, people's awareness of these issues. But back in the 80s, men like Ron would have come up against a brick wall of disbelief and stigma. Eventually, out of sheer desperation, Ron took out a restraining order against his ex-girlfriend and spoke in court on November the 13th, 1987 about the toll she was taking on him.
She continually calls me at all hours of the day and night. She shows up at my apartment and demands to come in. I have told her that I no longer want to see her. Today, she showed up at my place of work and verbally abused me in front of my fellow workers and my supervisor. This is the second time in a week she has appeared at my workplace. My job is now in jeopardy.
And the court found the whole thing amusing, and the judge stated that he had never been lucky enough to have an attractive woman following him around, and said Ron should be flattered, showing a lack of understanding of how dangerous a stalker can be and the distress their actions can cause. At the time, they had no way of knowing that just a few months later, elsewhere in California, 39-year-old software technician Richard Farley would go on a rampage at his Silicon Valley workplace and shoot 7 co-workers dead in the culmination of his obsession with colleague Laura Black, who he had been following around and intimidating for years. Farley's actions were the catalyst for anti-stalking laws to finally be brought in 1990. If the judges in Ron's case could have seen into the future, would they have taken him more seriously? Perhaps they would still have downplayed his fears because he was a man being pursued by a woman, rather than a woman being pursued by a man. Nevertheless, the judge granted a restraining order, but because he didn't see Ron as a victim, it was a mutual one, which meant that neither Ron nor Vicky were to go within 100 yards of Linda, and vice versa. This made Linda even angrier than when Ron and Vicky had moved away. She purchased a gun and spent hours on the shooting range, and simply ignored the restraining order. Shortly after it was issued, Ron found a note inside his apartment which read,
"A piece of paper is not going to stop me from getting to you."
Somehow she had managed to break in, but there were no signs of forced entry. Ron was horrified. His home should have been the one place that he felt safe once the doors were locked behind him, but now he felt that his haven had been violated, and Linda could get in any time she wanted. Ron took the notes to the police, but no witnesses had seen her leaving them, and there was not enough evidence that she'd broken the conditions of the restraining order, so they were powerless to arrest her. Vicky also received more disturbing letters, including one which said,
"I'm going to tear the two of you to the bone. It was never about you and Ron. It was always about me and Ron. I win, you lose."
Ron and Vicky regretfully ended their relationship, unable to cope any longer with the constant anguish. Ron moved around the area like a shadow, staying in different hotels and rentals and avoiding staying in one place for too long. He turned down offers from family and friends to move in with them, as he was fearful for their safety if they became Linda's next targets. Ron told a friend, Ray Hieronymus, that he now genuinely believed Linda really might try to kill him, and Ray warned him to be careful. But it seemed there was very little he could do except try his best to stay out of her way. He moved into another apartment in Carlsbad and allowed himself to hope that things would get better, noticing that Linda seemed to have gone quiet in the last couple of weeks. Little did he know that the reason she had gone to ground was because she was busy developing hundreds of photos she had taken of him while tracking his every move, and she was plotting her next nefarious steps. Linda used her wily charms to obtain Ron's latest address from the electricity company and secured a lease on an apartment next door to his on the 9th of December 1987. She was careful to stay hidden, not wanting to play her cards just yet, keeping it secret that she was closer than ever. While Ron tried to relax in his new home, Linda lurked unnoticed on the other side of the wall like a cunning predator, waiting to pounce. It gave her the perfect opportunity over the next few days to watch his routine and get to know his habits. Less than a week later, on December 14th, Ron returned from work carrying some beer and sandwiches that he'd picked up on the way home to enjoy that evening. As he stepped into his apartment, he heard a noise and spun round to see Linda emerging towards him from the darkness. The sight of her under any circumstances made his heart plummet, but this time it was worse than any previous occasion. She was brandishing a gun and had it pointed right at his heart. Before he had a chance to speak, she fired. A bullet hit Ron in the torso, and another whizzed past him, missing its mark. He pushed past her and tried to run down the stairs to escape the gunfire, but she pulled the trigger 3 more times. One bullet hit Ron in the back, and he staggered to the door of neighbour Janet Bates, shouting desperately for her to let him in. Janet was shocked at the sight of the blood-soaked young man and ushered him inside, where he collapsed next to her dining room table. She tried her best to keep him calm and then placed a call to the ambulance. As she dialed 911, she heard him murmur,
"Thank you for calling. For help."
These were the last words he would ever say. Ron was flown to the Paloma Memorial Hospital, where he later died of his gunshot wounds. After the shooting, Linda fled the scene, but turned herself in a few hours later. Her trial began in spring 1989, and she lodged a self-defense plea, claiming that Ron had asked her to meet him that night, and she was afraid he would hurt her, so she brought the gun and had been forced to use it when Ron lunged at her and tried to attack. Despite her best attempts to downplay her culpability, it was obvious that the murder was premeditated, and there was years' worth of evidence from Ron's family, friends and colleagues, as well as the restraining order, that the aggressor had always been Linda. Linda Ricchio was christened the Fatal Attraction Killer by the media, and it became clear that she was suffering from borderline personality disorder and struggled to regulate her emotions and anger. She'd become consumed by one thing, and one thing only: getting back with Ron. In her warped view of reality, she was the victim, and Ron and Vicky had deliberately tried to destroy her chances of happiness. Linda showed some sadness that Ron had died, but believed she'd had no choice and that it wouldn't have happened if she'd got her way. She said,
My sole intent never included willful, knowingly malicious actions or conduct, but purely harmless, heartfelt, and deserving attempts to communicate, to help me understand. The emotional stress and turmoil has exhausted me.
Her defense argument, which evolved slightly from the statement she originally gave police, was that she had planned to commit suicide in front of Ron, and that he tried to wrestle the gun from her, and in the chaos that followed, a shot went off by mistake and killed him. She claimed to only recall one shot, but ballistics proved there had been 5. Neither the judge nor anyone in the packed courtroom believed her illogical story. On 18th of April 1989, Linda Ricchio was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 27 years to life. Still in denial about her responsibility for Ron's death, when asked if she had any comments, she simply said,
This is absurd!
Ron's father, Ronald Ruse Sr., said sadly outside the courtroom,
This is the best we can have. This chapter is closed, but the feelings we have for the loss of our son are never closed.
The bereaved family launched their energies into helping to bring about anti-stalking legislation and raising public awareness that men can and do fall victim to stalking and domestic abuse. 4 years after she was jailed, Linda married a former guard she met while working in the prison kitchen until she divorced him in 2003 on the grounds of infidelity. She also sued another prison guard for sexually victimizing her, but an investigation proved that she was the one stalking him after covertly learning personal information about him from a mutual friend, following him around the prison and keeping a photo of him which she claimed he had given her, but which she had really obtained from an official document. Linda never admitted to her infatuation with the guard and claimed that he had set her up because he knew about her past from her inmate file. In 2005, she was moved to a higher security prison and was denied parole several times. Ron's sister Susan Fisher was appointed as a member of the parole board, and Linda made multiple complaints that Susan had an unfair level of influence on the decisions, even though she had never been part of any decisions directly about Linda. Ricchio continued to cause trouble and disturbance even from behind bars, and sued the Department of Corrections for refusing to transfer her back to the California Institute for Women and for not granting her parole. She also accused them of tampering with her file and giving false information that led to her parole applications being denied. Her case was groundless and was promptly dismissed. She currently remains in prison, but she feels she should be given a chance. She said,
I don't minimize my responsibility for Ron's death, and his death will live within me each and every day, whether I'm incarcerated or not. But I also believe I have served my time. I am not a threat to the victim's family or society.
It's doubtful that Ron's family would agree. Linda had not stopped at ruining the life of a young man who had so much to enjoy and look forward to. Following him, intimidating him, and putting an end to his new relationship was never enough for her. In her quest to control Ron Roose and every aspect of his life, the only way she could have absolute power over him was to kill him. We're left wondering whether things could have ended differently if Ron had been taken seriously by the justice system, and we can only hope that people are now far more aware that anyone can be a perpetrator of abuse in a relationship, and anyone can become a victim no matter their gender. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prash's Murder Map. There are several ways you can support the show if you're able to. The podcast is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife, so any help is greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and leave me a review wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can support me on Patreon, make a one-off donation via PayPal, or buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com. You can find all the links in the show notes. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandran.com. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you again soon.